Okay,
Kyle said something.
cam for a second.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
All right, so we're rolling.
Yep. All right. Wonderful. Okay, so welcome back to another scintillating night of the science of logic with Hegel. Just kind of that didn't copy anything. Scintillating. Okay, so first off, I'm going to ask, how's everybody doing with the reading? We're only on chapter two, and I say only chapter two, and chapter two, isn't that long compared with the rest of the book. It's only what, like maybe 50 pages, but the contents are so much more complex than even the encyclopedia let on, I think, because determinate being turns out to be an awful lot of things in the process of becoming what it is in truth. Um, I don't know. So impressions?
And I feel like I probably need to go over it again later, but what is that? The transition to determination kind of got me a bit, but after that, did like the fact that we actually kind of finally got kind of the borders between something and other figured
Right.
out.
The limit. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. One thing about the wiki that you're sort of working on, Kyle, the quote that I shared earlier today, it talks about oh, oh bother. What was the quote? I shared a quote earlier today, and I thought it was the neatest thing, but I also don't think I got the full flavor of it until I read a certain distance into Hoolgate and said, "Oh, wait, okay, wait a minute," because it's much more, I don't know, deeper than I thought. So let's see here. Is that the only one I shared? I don't know. I'll just read it out. This is Stephen Hoolgate's quote. He says, in the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant maintains that all change in the sphere of appearance presupposes time. As Hegel conceives it here, however, change is not alteration in time. It cannot be this, since being is not yet proven to be temporal and will not do so until the philosophy of nature. Change is conceived here as nothing but the process of becoming other than one is, and other than that, and so on. This is not to deny that concrete change in the world requires time, yet Hegel is not endeavoring here to provide a comprehensive account of temporal worldly change. His aim is rather to show that even in the absence of time, every something must change purely by virtue of being other. Time is thus not the ultimate source of change. The latter is made necessary by the simple fact that there is something and something else at all. Okay. And I take a lot out of this, but okay, here's the correct quote. All right, well, that's an important quote too, but this is a big one from him in his new book. He says speculative logic, however, is not a set of judgments about a fixed subject matter being, but it is rather the process of discovering what its subject matter is, how being is to be understood. So in the context of your new wiki, like I noticed the old wiki like has a list of what goes into being determinate being, right? But the fact is that if you read it along with, especially with Holgate, he makes it a lot more explicit. This is not a laundry list of what determinate being is, but what it is in the process of becoming as it articulates itself. Okay. So if you just make it a list, and the question is, the question becomes, okay, well, the list has a certain order. Does other come before something, or should something become before other? But this way of talking about it assumes that determinate being, Dasein, has a full manifold inside itself as it is itself. Well, the problem is that depending on where you turn in the chapter, determinate being means a great many different things in the process of unfolding. And especially in the later sections where you get toward limit, it's not at all what it was when it's just determinate being in general. You know what I mean? It's a lot more simple. And that's why when you look at what speculative philosophy, speculative logic is supposed to impart to us about the subject, it's not so much filling out a definition or even a complex definition of what determinate being is, but we're looking at determinate being in its abstract category, I guess you could say, and saying, what does this entail, and why does what it entails lead necessarily to more complex forms of something? Because something, an early version of determinate being turns out to be quite complex once you get toward the end of the chapter, but it's not upon its introduction. And so, um, I don't, I don't, I don't know. It's one of those things where you're reading through the different transitions and you realize how much of what is in this one chapter colors so much of what comes after. I mean, the connectedness between two of the aspects of determinate being of something end up looking a great deal like what happens in essence, where you can't have one without the other. But in this early stage, you can have one without the other, or at least it seems that that's the case. In actual fact, you can't, but it cannot be so determined yet until we get to until essence. Um, I'm going to stop talking for a few minutes, just because I know other people might have something to say, and I don't know. Y'all have been reading it, so any. I mean, even if it seems small, or you know stupid question, anything. What other impressions have you all come across?
I think the notion that change might be possible without time is an issue. It's cropping up in contemporary cosmology. Some quantum cosmologists will argue that that there was change even before time began, with the Big Bang. So that would seem to be an example where Hegel might be relevant for modern physics. Problem is, most contemporary physicists don't have little training in philosophy. Unlike, say, 100 years ago, when people like Einstein and Bohr and Heisenberg were very much literate in philosophy.
Yeah, and qualitative being, which is the kind that we're dealing with right now, is a very difficult thing to. I mean, in this age anymore, everything is quantity today. Talking about qualitative being at that basic fundamental level, I think goes beyond the ability of a lot of people. So I made some notes, and so I'm just going to try to read some of them out. Not so much notes as highlights, if y'all are cool with that. Um, um, I'd like to get to the point this week to go back through the notes and try to map out where he's going with each shape and why we're going that way, but maybe more pictorially, like Ben did with capital, Doug. I'm not exactly sure how it's going to turn out because, well, I don't know. I just haven't put my hand to it. Kyle has more than I have. He started that wiki based on what is available out there in Wikiland as far as like collecting up like how these transitions work, moving from one to another. So okay, so Hoolgate in his new book really does a good job in taking you from one thing to another and telling you why. And so starting off with like something, he says what we have before us is being that is not just immediate nor just determinate, but explicitly self-relating, simple self-relation in the form of being. And its quality relates to itself, both with an accent on being as well as on negation. That's called reality and negation. And so, it's self-relating, simple self-relating, as he puts it. Let's see. It can arise only through the mediation of difference and its sublation. So beforehand, we did not have a difference in determinate being, and now we do. There's a difference within it. Okay. Let's see what else he said that in coming to be self-relating and so being a self of its own, Dasein acquires a logical interior that is missing from previous categories. Reality and negation do not have an interior of their own. See. It is true that each reality and negation does not contain that other within its own interiority, since it does not yet constitute a self-relating space of ownness that could have an interior. As explicitly self-relating, however, Dasein does enclose a space of its own within its self-relation. Accordingly, Hegel states it is being that is within itself. Okay, so he gives us in sich, which is within itself. Has a manifold structure inside the category that carries difference inside it. Okay, so and we talked about this a little bit before. Being within self is simply being with its own inside, self-relating being as such. When being is self-relating in this way, it is what it is by itself. Being that has the form of an itself. Let's see. Is something. In Hegel's view, there cannot be just be being, nothing, becoming, or determinate being, but there must at least be something. Why? Because being and nothing are so unstable that they prove to be becoming. Becoming then settles into determinate being, and determinate being in turn must be self-relating determinacy or something. There is therefore something, therefore, not simply because something is given, but because logically being must take the form of something. It is logically and ontologically necessary that there be something. Yeah, and he gives that quote about speculative logic, not being a set of judgments about a fixed subject matter, but is rather the process of discovering what its subject matter is. Let's see. Yeah, he says, to put the point in a more ontological way, the claim is that being itself consists in being something. The further development of speculative logic will then disclose what it means to be something beyond self-relating determinacy, and it will demonstrate that it means, among other things, being limited and being finite, which is basically the terms of all matter and, in our external universe, being finite and being limited. Let's see. The logical form of something has the structure of a quite minimal self. He derives the category of something immanently from that of pure being. In the logical structure of something, however, we can see the self-relation that later, in a more developed form, will characterize subjectivity and self-consciousness. And then he gets into some negation and negativity. He goes into talking about the other. Woolgate specifically makes the claim that let's see here. Woolgate says that Hegel does not explain as clearly as he could why something must have an other. Indeed, the argument he provides in the 5th paragraph is actually illegitimate by his own criterion, because it is not immanent. Hegel begins with an unproblematic reminder of the affirmative character of something. Something is and is therefore also a determinate being. Then, however, he adds the anticipatory remark that something is in itself also becoming. This remark as it stands is not justified by the logical structure of something as it has been set out so far, but anticipates what something will later prove to be. This is confirmed a few lines down when Hegel states that as becoming, something is a transition, the moments of which are themselves something, and for that reason, it is change. For something does not prove logically to be changed until a couple pages later. It is from the anticipatory idea that something is in itself also becoming, however, that Hegel derives the other. He does so by arguing that just as pure becoming has being and nothing for its moments, so the becoming that something proves to be must have something, and the negative of something, the other, as its moments. The other is thus not derived immanently from the structure of something as such, but from the structure of Dasein that gives rise to it, but it is introduced illegitimately on the basis of an anticipatory remark. And then he says, and this is where he kind of saves it a little bit. He says, there is, however, a purely immanent reason why something must have another. This becomes apparent when we recall that quality, which gives rise logically to something, comprises the two moments of reality and negation. And when we render fully explicit the fact that each moment relates to itself in differing from the other, because each is contained in the other from which it differs, it is thus not just quality as such that proves to be self-relating, but reality and negation as well. Recall, too, that the difference between reality and negation is not simply eliminated in something, but is sublated, that is, canceled and preserved in it. Something must therefore be both self-relating reality and self-relating negation, and so must take two different forms at the same time. Insofar as reality relates to itself, it constitutes something in an affirmative sense. This something coincides with the one we have already encountered, namely something as self-related being. Since reality contains negation, the something it constitutes must also contain negation and so be self-relating negation. Yet it is only implicitly, not explicitly negative, since it is explicitly affirmative, self-relating reality. In Hegel's words, it is something in the form of being as the negation of negation. And he goes on. He's like Hegel's pages on these points are rather compact, and Houlgate sort of unfolds them and tries to make even more explicit what's going on. So yeah. I would ask what questions other people have. Yeah, I'm going to read this out really quick. I highlighted the long quote, so bear with me. This is going back to the beginning. So being and nothing are immediately and absolutely distinct. That is to say, each is purely itself with no trace of the other. Being is pure being with no further determination, and nothing is equally sheer and utter nothing. Pure being and sheer nothing thus exclude one another completely, and so cannot and do not coexist. They do indeed vanish into one another. In so doing, however, they do not coexist, but alternate. Being vanishes into nothing, which vanishes into being, and so on. Reality and negation, by contrast, do coexist. They are the two sides of a single difference, and so are inextricably bound together. They also contain one another, but in so doing do not cease to be moments of a difference. Reality, which conceals negation in itself, is thus reality not negation, and negation which conceals reality in itself is negation not reality. And just imagine those being like German words with the dashes in between the not. The difference between something and its other, on the other hand, further up, is different from both these differences. Like reality and negation, something and its other coexist, but they are not mere moments of a difference because they are self-relating. They're both self-relating determinacies. Each is thus something of its own, and as such is quite separate from the other. They are inseparable in the sense that there cannot be one without the other. There's never just something, but always at least something and another. Yet they are also separate from one another in being self-relating. So as you can see, the structure of each of these processing forms of determinate being get progressively more complex, and they show the character of what has been sublated previously in various ways. Not always one for one, and you can't, well, I mean, you don't always know which previous sublated category is going to poke its head up, right? Like change ends up being a form of becoming, but far more complex than what becoming in its simplicity, just as the vanishing of being and nothing were. Does some of that make sense so far? So yeah, being other than something thus consists in being separate from it, not in being its simple negation. This difference between two ways of being different is not always recognized in everyday life, nor do Hegel's commentators and critics always credit him with recognizing it or recognize it themselves. It is, however, an important difference that readers should keep clearly in mind as they continue through the logic. Let's see. Indeed, as we shall see, All three kinds of difference will appear in various modifications and combinations throughout the logic. Yeah, this is what I was talking about before. Being and nothing are no longer purely themselves, but an immediate difference between them remains sublated in subsequent determinations. It is what enables us to distinguish, for example, between quality with the accent on being and quality with the accent on the not. This latter difference being one-sided between one-sided determinacies has for the moment been lost in the idea of self-relating determinacy, yet it too will re-emerge. Indeed, the further development of something and other consists precisely in their becoming two sides of a single difference. This occurs when something and other proves to be bound together by a common limit. At that point, something and other are no longer just other than one another, but also the explicit negation of one another, and so properly determinate. You see how that gets just a little bit more complex, but we're also sort of talking about a similar movement as further as down the spiral. It's actually quite fun to see.
It does also feel like you're zooming the focus on your camera on more on the thing every single time.
Yeah. And being able to track the parallels of those differences, I think would be an important feature of whatever pictorial representation that there needs to be, because every time you start going around that corner, right, when it ends up being parallel, you got to draw a line between the earlier one and the current one, and then draw a line from that later one to a much later one that's also parallel with that difference. And so track how they're moved. Well, I mean, how the movement occurs. It's at this point in the book, and it's really early, that I realize why Hegel is so insistent on saying all of his headings are just sort of placeholders. They're completely arbitrary, because dealing with the different moments is the word he used, moments of determinate being as something, and so on and so forth. It's hard to categorize them in their movement such that you can keep complete organizational track of them. You know, it can't be as simple as a list of what determinate being consists of, because early in determinate being's process, it's not that. It can't be that at all. Later in the process, as the logic unfolds, then it is, and it contains these determinations and various things that you can say about it. And so, yeah, it definitely wouldn't be able to be captured very well by bourgeois science or thinking. This is a this is like trying to track something that's 3D in purely 2D space. Or for us, I mean, for us, we live in the 3D space. Imagine trying to, first of all, conceive of something in 4 dimensions, 4 spatial dimensions, not just time, right? That's one interpretation where time is the 4th dimension. In other versions, it's a spatial dimension, and you imagine a 4D object intersecting with our 3D space, and it's just, you know, and it looks like a tesseract, or something along those lines. But not all of the tesseract is visible to our eyes, which can only see the 3D. This is sort of like that movement, that process. It disappears out of view if you're not grabbing a hold of it and riding along with it, if that makes any sense. Seconds open.
Yeah, I think it was last week or the week before. You're the one who suggested the analogy with flatland.
Yeah.
You know, beings who live in a 2-dimensional world trying to figure out how to conceive of three-dimensional objects.
And it's where you get to the point of dealing with something in its other, and you look at other in its otherness, that change itself is given a more determinate form. And change being, like a later form of becoming, and so on. Let's see here. And what you find is that when something changes, the intrinsic, whatever the thing is that changed, as long as it doesn't go over the limit of what it is qualitatively, it still is what it is, logically, I should say. And so, and he deals with that categorically, being, yeah, yeah. It's that quote that I read earlier about Kant. Kant looks at how change it presupposes time, and Hegel says no, it's the intrinsic logic of determinate things, something, and its other, for example, that lead to the logical, the logical idea of a change at all, in that something and its other implies that something's going to become other, and that other can other itself, in other words, change from what it is into something else, and so on. And it starts out pretty simply as things change, but they remain the same. In other words, the something's integrity remains the same. But then he starts to talk about limit, and I think that's also the limit where I finished reading.
Yeah, I mentioned Kant, but you can go back to Plato. But Plato, the forms were eternal and unchanging. Change is something that exists only in the external world, which is basically not as real as the realm of forms is. And Hegel is basically contradicting Plato. There's even in Plato's realm of forms, I think Hegel would say that you can have change there as well.
Yeah. So two big terms that come up at this stage, and it's still determinate being, are being in itself and being for other. And all he means by being in itself is that something is what it is. Um, uh, shit, sorry. Yeah, when he says being for another, it doesn't mean that the being is that the something is at the mercy of or at subject to the other. He means for in the sense of related to. So there's being in itself, right? And being as related to an other. And and those categories are about as abstract as they sound. Um, yeah, it's simply Hegel's shorthand for related to. Um, Something is thus not only related to another because there is another out there, it is also so related because other relatedness or being for other belongs to what it is to be something. Something as it is here conceived as itself something in relation to another. To use the terminology favored at the end of the 19th century, something is internally related to other things. Okay, and this is actually as I don't know, as familiar as it sounds. When we're thinking of things in the external world, and we're thinking of how things are related to each other, touch each other, move around each other, the whole thing, right? I mean, we all interact in this finite, limited space, right? And what he's slowly unfolding in the logic is the sort of attribute that shows that something isn't just there and unreachable. It's reachable by many other things, and other things are just as structured logically as the something was, right? And it has the ability to be changed by those other things, but still remain the same. But as well, it has the ability to other itself, to reach its limit in time or space, or be destroyed and become something else. And with that thought, that the note in the phenomenology about how the plant moves from the seed to the shoot to the plant, it bears a fruit, it has seeds and whatnot, and each one of these states destroys the previous one. That kind of gets a little bit to what I think he means, although at this stage we're talking about the abstract categories that lend meaning to those to that illustration in the first place, I think. Over this week, I'm going to try to get a good, solid summary put together for next week so that we can finish out the chapter on determinate being completely, so that, hopefully we can see it pictorially and also descriptively. And so I could probably read it out. I don't know how long it would take me to read it out, but I have the feeling it would probably be helpful because I haven't gone past chapter 2 after this point. I keep getting stuck on it, mostly because I keep thinking about determinate being as something which is, I mean, like I said, I keep thinking with my bourgeois brain that it's going to add up to something as a complete determinate being at the end. And that result will be the sum total of being determinate. But it's not. It's the process. And even saying that, it sounds like magic coming out of my mouth. You know what I mean? But what it also means, I think, is that you can talk about the early versions of the process and the later ones and not lose sight of what it is to be determinate being. It's a little like talking about the commodity in its fully abstracted version at the very beginning of chapter 1 of Capital. In fact, most people, because they can relate to it so materialistically, like it's right there, right, that they easily do it. The problem is that when they relate the early abstract version of the commodity, just as use, value, and value, to more articulated versions of the capital circuit, that I think some of the explanations go haywire. You know what I mean? Because if you just do that, right, without including what else it implies about labor, abstractly or concretely, and so on and so forth, you in your analytic, you could delete parts of Marx's logical derivation of the commodity in its fullness. And when you do that, you're really just jumping the track. And that's one thing I think Schelling ended up doing with Hegel, is trying to redefine what being and nothing and becoming and determinate being meant in the first place. So as to jump the track completely to what he thought philosophically, the Prussian nation needed to go. And it's very easy to do that with a logical explanation, because not many people have training, in the common parlance and being able to follow those arguments. And so deleting one or more of those arguments is actually quite easily, if no one knows them to this extent. Does that make sense? Let's see if I highlighted anything else. I'm not sure if I did. I just read it through all the way to limit. Yeah, he talks about determination and constitution. Yeah, he says that being in itself and being for other are the two sides in their unity that make up um, the determination of something, right? Constitution itself is the negation of that thing in itself, I believe. Although now that I say that, it's probably, let's see. Determination is the affirmative determinacy as the being in itself, to which something in its determinate being remains true in face of its entanglement with the other that would determine it, preserving itself in its equality with itself and asserting the latter in its being for other. So that's Hegel. And then the constitution of something stands in direct relation to what is other than the thing. That other is itself something with an intrinsic being. Moreover, it asserts its intrinsic being in its relation to the first something. Since the constitution of the first something is not determined by the thing itself, it must therefore be determined by what the other asserts itself to be. Accordingly, Hegel writes, constituted in this way or that way, something is caught up in external influences and relationships and is determined by an other. Something does not just have a constitution, therefore, but is constituted in a certain way by the other. So the determination is more of a passive but more complex version of just being what it is. And then constitution, well, like he just said, is more of an active influence of the other on the something. Well, one something on another something is another way of saying that as well. I don't remember. I know we read the EL, but I do not remember going through these parts quite as in this detailed way, and I'm not even sure I understood it quite in the way that Houlgate is forcing me to in the actual text. Hegel notes that being determined by an other does not just befall something as a matter of contingency, it is a necessary feature of being something at all. Logically, something must have an intrinsic identity as well as its own way of relating to an other. Furthermore, its identity must preserve itself in and thereby determine its relation to another. At the same time, however, such identity cannot completely determine a thing's relation to the other, for there remains a difference between being in itself and being for other. And he goes on. And then he says that there's an identity of determination and constitution, which itself gives rise to a limit, because here we have a more complex version of being it or something and the other. coming together in explicit borderline between the something and the other. Before that, the border between something and the other was far more indeterminate, right? Like you would talk about the relation between the two and what makes up the two, the something and the other. But as far as finding the actual, like, down to the wire borderline, we hadn't gotten there yet. And with the unity, okay, here it is. I highlighted this a little bit. Let me see if it gives us something cool. Something must have an intrinsic being or determination of its own that remains what it is, as other aspects of the thing are changed by the encounter with other things. Such intrinsic being is not a mere fiction, but is logically and ontologically necessary. Yet this intrinsic being is itself vulnerable to being changed by other things, and in that respect forms part of the constitution of the thing. At the same time, however, it remains logically distinct from the latter, since it is perpetually reconstituted as the thing's new intrinsic being or character by the changes that are imposed on it. Despite the fact that it is subject to change, therefore, a thing's intrinsic character or being in itself, in each new form that it acquires, remains distinct from and enjoys a certain stability relative to other mutable features of the thing. So according to speculative logic, no thing has an absolutely unchanging identity, but every aspect of things is exposed to the transformative influence of other things. Yet things still have an intrinsic character that at each stage of its mutation confers a relatively stable identity on them. And he said something really cool in here. I'm going to find it because he starts going on. He starts going into the limit and this may be earlier than that, talking about change. I really enjoyed this part. He says that the changes that other things bring about in something, here we're talking about something and the other still, may well alter the thing's intrinsic being and identity, but they do not deprive the thing of such an identity altogether. On the contrary, they give it a new reconstituted intrinsic being. This is an inevitable consequence of the nature of change as it is conceived here. To change something is necessarily to give it a new being and identity of its own. From the perspective of Hegel's logic, there is nothing that the foes of intrinsic being or being in itself, such as, for example, Nietzsche, can do about it. They try, but what they end up doing is denying that change is quite basic logically to everything around us, right? It's not just tied to time or space. In fact, those are determinations far, far above where we're talking about. So yeah, I kind of enjoyed that. He kind of digs at Nietzsche a little bit. I haven't read much Nietzsche, but I'm guessing that has to do with the idea of like an intrinsic character that's like forever. To be forever German is to be, German down to your bones, right? Anyway.
Nietzsche, he professed to despise Kant, but he was very Kantian still.
I think in a lot of ways, Kant brings a lot of relief to, or sort of defines the problems far more explicitly than the earlier empiricists like Hume did.
Yeah.
And even in posing the question, even if you say, nah, No, it's still what you think it is. You've still posed the question and opened yourself up to, well, let's see if we can answer that question, which Hegel does in much of his work. Um, I find that interesting. So we've got 5 minutes left, and I know how far have people gotten?
I've gotten to right before the ought remark.
Okay. Yeah, same here, although I did not understand it all yet. Doug, where are you?
Page 133.
Same. Yeah. Yeah. Um, I think we're doing good. We're doing good for not having a teacher, like an explicit teacher situation. But I think we're doing good talking about this. Since it's the last 5 minutes, I'll just talk about this really quick. So yeah, so we're at 133, the ought remark. And from there, the end of the chapter is quite a bit further away than I thought. 156. What I'd propose that I'd like to do coming in next time is have a short summary of everything up until the point on 133 based on Houlgate's reading, which, as far as I can tell, is following exactly what Hegel is doing, more or less. And from there, we can start talking about the ought. Let's read. What am I going to do? Sorry, guys, I suck. Okay, let's read from page 133 to 143. Let's just call it 10 pages to make it easy, but also to leave room for my proposed summary next time, just to sort of get us up to the ought remark, to the point where we can talk about it in light of the full process. Sound good? All right, great. I just to let you know, I reposted in the group a copy of Hegel's Hegel on Being, Volume 1. I had posted it ages ago, but I put it on the featured and just commented underneath. What I would suggest that you do as you're doing your reading, sort of parallel, try to read a little bit along with Houlgate on the section that you're looking at, because he really does help you understand it a lot better than the text does at first. I don't know, it just makes it easier. So if there's nothing else,
I was thinking of contrasting Hegel with Aristotle. Aristotelian logic, he had basically like three axioms. He had a lot of self-identity, A is A. He had a lot of excluded middle, A is either B or not B. And he has a lot of contradiction. A cannot be both B and not B at the same time. And Hegel is basically challenging all three of those laws.
Especially the third one. Oh yeah.
Even the first one, even what we just discussed now is basically saying, A can be A, but also not A at the same time. So it's even challenging a lot of self-identity.
Eventually, I'm planning on reading through a lot of those previous philosophies to try to get a better bead on what they are. And I think reading Hegel's philosophy will enable me to do that a lot more cleanly than if I just sort of picked it up and, just wandered through it blindly. It's definitely a good springboard.